Elijah Jackson had always believed that the sky was the only place where he could truly be free. From the first moment he saw a plane cut across the clouds, his heart had whispered a promise. One day, he would be up there too. But no one ever warned him that the ground could be far more dangerous than the endless blue above. On this morning, he stepped into Dulles International Airport with eyes shining brighter than the sunrise, holding tightly to the special FAA badge pinned proudly to his chest. Every step echoed with the dreams he had carried since childhood, every breath filled with the scent of jet fuel and possibility. He could already feel the vibrations of the engines in his veins, hear the silent call of the cockpit inviting him closer, whispering that he belonged. Yet as he crossed the terminal, past the endless lines of travelers and blinking departure boards, a quiet shiver crawled up his spine, a feeling he didn't understand, like a storm forming far beyond the horizon. Moments later, sitting alone in the pilot's lounge, he watched a documentary on the golden age of aviation. His fingers lightly tapped on the armrest, matching the rhythm of the soaring music in his head, lost in the thought of one day gripping a control yoke, guiding a plane into the sky as his heart finally broke free. He didn't notice the sharp footsteps approaching, or the heavy shadow that swallowed the light spilling across the floor. When Captain Rebecca Whitman burst into the room, her eyes fixed on him with cold disbelief, Elijah felt the ground open beneath him. In a single frozen heartbeat, he understood that sometimes your biggest enemy isn't gravity. It's the cruel weight of a world that refuses to let you fly. Elijah Jackson would spend hours staring out his bedroom window, tracing the flight paths of planes that left white scars against the blue sky. Each passing aircraft felt like a silent promise, a distant whisper that the world above was waiting for him. In his room, tiny plastic models of planes crowded every shelf. Posters of legendary aircraft covered the walls like sacred murals in a quiet chapel. The faint hum of engines played endlessly in his mind, a private soundtrack only he could hear. From the age of 6, when his father took him to his first airshow, Elijah knew that flying wasn't just a dream, it was his calling. That day, standing beneath the roaring shadow of a Boeing 777, he felt something awaken inside him, like a star lighting up in a dark corner of the universe. David Jackson, his father, always stood a few steps behind, his hand firm on Elijah's shoulder, grounding him yet pushing him higher. David worked at the Federal Aviation Administration, a man of quiet authority and unwavering discipline, but he always became soft when he looked at his son. "Someday, Eli, you'll be up there," David would say, his voice steady as a guiding star. "And when you do, don't just fly, soar." Elijah carried those words like a secret engine in his chest, a hidden force that powered every late-night drawing of cockpit schematics, every essay about aerodynamics. At school, when others scoffed or looked puzzled at his obsession, Elijah just smiled, knowing they couldn't hear the sky calling his name. He often stayed up past midnight, fingers wrapped around a joystick, eyes locked on flight simulators that transformed his small desk into a boundless horizon. His mother sometimes knocked on the door, gently reminding him to rest, but David would stand behind her, a quiet gleam of pride in his eyes, and she would sigh, letting him stay up a little longer. Elijah's hands learned the delicate dance of takeoffs and landings, each virtual maneuver building the muscle memory of future triumphs. The walls around him felt more like runways than barriers, each poster a window into the skies that felt more real than the ground beneath his feet. When the email from the FAA internship program arrived, Elijah's breath caught in his throat. It was a simple subject line. "Congratulations, Elijah Jackson." But those words carried the weight of all his years of longing, all the silent nights whispering to the stars. He didn't open it at first. He just stared, his fingers trembling over the mouse, terrified that reality might betray the dream he had nurtured so carefully. David stood behind him once again, his steady presence wrapping around Elijah like a second skin. "Open it, son," David said, his voice a soft push against the fear. Elijah clicked. When he saw the words "accepted" and "pilot lounge visit" in bold letters, his heart seemed to split open, flooding his veins with light. He turned to his father, and they embraced, a moment of quiet victory that felt louder than any jet engine roar. Elijah wept into his father's shoulder, the kind of tears that tasted like salt and sunrise, relief and belief. It wasn't just an acceptance letter. It was an invitation to step into the world he had only touched in dreams. As they stood together in that small room filled with models and sky-colored posters, Elijah finally believed that the universe had heard his quiet prayers. The boy who had once only watched the sky was now ready to step into it. And in that fragile, brilliant moment, nothing felt impossible. Elijah woke before the sun, his heart already soaring above the still-sleeping city. The morning air felt sharp and electric as he dressed, each movement careful, reverent, as if preparing for a sacred flight rather than a simple visit. He smoothed the shirt collar again and again, fingers trembling slightly, eyes flicking to the badge that gleamed on his desk like a small piece of the sky. David stood by the doorway, arms crossed, a quiet pride glowing in his gaze. "You ready to meet the sky today?" he asked, voice low and warm. Elijah nodded, unable to find words big enough to match the swell inside his chest. The drive to Dulles International Airport felt like a journey between worlds. Outside the car window, the city drifted past in sleepy grays and soft dawn light, but inside Elijah's mind, there was only blue, the deep, endless blue of possibility. When they pulled up to the curb, David turned to his son, his hand firm on Elijah's shoulder. "Remember, son, you belong there. You don't have to prove it to anyone but yourself." Elijah stepped out, feeling the terminal's cold tile beneath his shoes and the rush of travelers weaving around him like a river in flood. He clutched his badge so tightly the edges dug into his palm, grounding him amid the chaotic music of rolling suitcases and distant boarding calls. Near the information desk, a tall woman with kind eyes waved a bright FAA folder. "Tanya Reynolds, HR," she introduced herself, her voice crisp but gentle. Elijah handed over his documents, his hands shaking just enough for her to notice. She smiled, a quiet reassurance, and guided him through security with practiced ease. Elijah moved through the terminal, eyes wide, drinking in every detail, the gleaming shop windows, the scent of roasted coffee drifting past, the echo of flight numbers bouncing off high glass walls. When they reached the pilot's lounge, Tanya paused. "You can wait here. I'll step out to finish some paperwork, but you're safe." "Relax, enjoy," she said, tapping his badge softly before leaving. The door closed behind her, and Elijah stepped forward, his breath catching at the hush inside. The room felt like a cathedral, soft leather chairs lined up facing a large TV screen playing an aviation documentary. A model Concorde rested in a glass case near the corner, its sharp nose aimed toward an invisible sky. Elijah moved slowly to one of the seats, sinking in as if it might disappear beneath him. His eyes locked onto the screen, watching black-and-white footage of the first commercial flights, the roar of engines blending into a quiet hymn in his mind. His fingers tapped against the armrest in rhythm, a secret beat only he could hear, as though each note whispered his future. Outside the lounge window, planes taxied gracefully along the tarmac, giant birds poised on the edge of a dream. Elijah's chest rose and fell in deep, steady breaths. Here, for the first time, he felt so close he could almost reach up and press his palm to the sky. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the vibrations of the airport seep into his bones, imagining the weight of a yoke in his hands, the taste of the clouds on his lips. In that stillness, surrounded by polished floors and silent aircraft models, Elijah felt both small and infinite at once. A quiet sense of belonging spread through him, a warmth blooming from the core outward. But behind the door, an invisible storm was already gathering, a cold wind that had been waiting for this exact moment to strike. Elijah breathed in, unaware of the shadow moving closer, believing, even if just for a heartbeat, that nothing could pull him down now. The door swung open with a force that shattered the calm like glass under a hammer. Elijah jerked upright, eyes wide, as a sharp silhouette filled the doorway. Captain Rebecca Whitman stepped in, her uniform immaculate, her shoulders squared beneath 4 gleaming gold stripes that announced her authority before she even spoke. Her eyes, sharp and pale as winter ice, fixed on Elijah like a predator finding prey. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the air thinning around him as though the sky had collapsed onto his chest. Whitman's lips twisted into a thin, unimpressed line as she scanned him from head to toe. "You," she spat, her voice slicing through the hush. "What are you doing in here?" Elijah's throat tightened. He stood slowly, his badge shaking in his grasp like a fragile bird. I'm Elijah Jackson," he stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Part of the FAA internship program. Miss Reynolds brought me—" Whitman stepped forward, cutting off his words with a dismissive wave of her hand. "This lounge is for pilots, not for visitors," she snapped, her tone coiling with contempt. Her gaze dropped to the badge, narrowing with instant suspicion. "Let me see that," she demanded, snatching it from his hands before he could react. Elijah's fingers twitched, empty and cold now, as Whitman flipped the badge over, eyes darting across it with a sneer growing on her face. "A fake," she declared, her voice rising, echoing against the walls. "Security, we have a breach here." The words slammed into Elijah's ears like thunderclaps. His breath hitched, his heart stumbling inside his ribs. Around him, the few pilots in the lounge turned, eyes sharpening, whispers sparking like small fires in dry grass. Elijah raised his hands slightly, palms open, his voice trembling. "Please, ma'am, it's real. Miss Reynolds, she gave it to me herself. I'm supposed to be here, please call her." Whitman scoffed, her laugh brittle and cruel. "Oh, I'm sure you have a lovely story," she said, stepping even closer, her shadow swallowing his. "But this isn't some field trip. You don't belong here. You are a security risk." Elijah's head spun. He searched the room for a friendly face, for any sign of support, but found only cold curiosity and creeping judgment. His feet felt heavy, pinned to the floor as if they had grown roots he couldn't cut away. Whitman raised her voice again, this time addressing the gathering pilots who now stood at the edges of the room like silent judges. "See, this is how it starts. Unauthorized entry, faked credentials. Who knows what he's here to do?" Each word was another stone thrown into the fragile glass of Elijah's dream. Sweat pooled along his hairline, his breaths coming in quick, shallow waves. He wanted to speak, to scream that he was innocent, that he only came to watch, to learn, to breathe the same air as those who had already touched the sky. But the words stuck in his throat, heavy and jagged. Whitman stepped back, flicking her wrist to her radio. "Security now," she ordered sharply. "We have an intruder who needs to be removed immediately." The pilots whispered louder, their eyes on Elijah turning from curiosity to suspicion, to something darker, as if he were a stain on the pristine floor, a crack in the perfect glass. Elijah felt his knees wobble. His dreams, those delicate wings he had built from midnight prayers and endless sketches, trembled, threatening to shatter under the weight of her words. He looked at the door, silently begging for someone, anyone, to walk in and tell them the truth. But the door remained shut. In that moment, Elijah felt utterly alone, a single soul stranded on a silent runway, waiting for a liftoff that might never come. Elijah's fingers fumbled for his phone as if it were the last rope keeping him from falling into a bottomless pit. His hands shook so violently he almost dropped it, the badge now gone, his identity stripped away like a torn wing. He scrolled through his contacts, each second stretching out like an endless corridor, his breath sharp and shallow. David Jackson. His father. His anchor. Elijah pressed the call button, the screen glowing against his trembling palm. The first ring felt like a scream inside his skull. The second ring hammered against his ribs. Finally, a warm, steady voice answered, slicing through the terror like a beam of sunlight through storm clouds. "Ellie, you okay?" Elijah tried to speak, but his throat tightened, words bubbling up in broken pieces. "Dad, they think I don't belong here. They took my badge. They called security. I don't know what to do." A heavy silence followed, then David's voice, low but firm like a steel cable. "Stay calm, Elijah. Do not move. I'm coming. Right now. I won't let them do this to you." Elijah clutched the phone to his ear, as if he could hold onto his father through the thin screen. For a fleeting second, warmth flickered in his chest, a small flame against the icy wind in the room. But then Whitman's voice sliced through again, sharp and merciless. "Oh, calling Daddy now. You think that's going to save you?" The pilots laughed softly, their chuckles echoing in Elijah's ears like cruel ghosts. Elijah turned away, pressing the phone closer, as if the plastic could shield him from their eyes. Outside the lounge, the shuffle of heavy boots approached, the low murmur of radios growing louder. Security was coming. His chest rose and fell in shallow waves, sweat dripping down his back, pooling at the base of his spine like cold rain. He looked around one last time, hoping to see Tanya, to see even a flicker of kindness, but the door stayed closed. Whitman stepped forward, smirking, her eyes glinting with cold satisfaction. "I warned you. You people think you can just walk in anywhere, wear a fake badge, and no one will question you. Well, not here." Elijah's lips parted, but no sound came. His voice had evaporated under the heat of humiliation and fear. In his mind, he saw his father's hands guiding his first model plane, the two of them laughing under a blanket of stars, voices rising into the night like small, brave aircraft. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing that memory to wrap around him, to drown out the whispers, the cruel laughter, the heavy boots closing in. Outside, David's car screeched to a halt, tires crying out against the pavement as if echoing Elijah's silent scream. Inside, the pilots stepped back, forming a silent ring around him, their faces masks of judgment and disapproval. The door finally opened. Two uniformed security officers stepped in, eyes hard, hands already resting on their belts. Elijah felt his legs tremble, his breath turning to thin threads. He knew his father was somewhere beyond those walls, fighting his own silent war to reach him. But inside this room, at this moment, Elijah was a lone bird in a cage, his wings pinned by invisible weights. Whitman pointed at him with a single, sharp finger. "That's him. Take him." Elijah's heart stuttered, each beat echoing in his head like the last seconds before a crash. As the officers advanced, Elijah whispered into the phone, voice almost gone. "Dad, please, hurry." And though the world pressed in, and every gaze felt like a blade, Elijah held onto that single, fragile connection. The only light left in a room quickly filling with shadows. The door to the pilot's lounge burst open so hard it slammed against the wall, echoing like a thunderclap through the stunned silence. David Jackson stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room before he even spoke. His suit was still sharp from his morning meetings, but his eyes burned with a storm no uniform could contain. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then David stepped forward, each footfall heavy and sure, his gaze locked on Elijah. Elijah's eyes flooded, relief and terror colliding in his chest like two planes on a collision course. David closed the space between them in 3 strides, placing a firm hand on Elijah's trembling shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but carrying enough weight to quiet every whisper. Elijah nodded, his mouth open but words stuck behind the dam of emotion. David's hand squeezed, a silent promise that he was no longer alone. David turned then, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room, slicing through each pilot like a blade of truth. His eyes settled on Captain Whitman. She shifted her weight, her confident posture cracking under the weight of his stare. David took a step closer to her, his presence a force field pushing everyone else back. "I'm David Jackson," he said, his voice ringing out with calm authority. "Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration." A ripple of shock swept through the pilots, some stepping back, eyes wide. Whitman's face paled, her jaw tightening as she tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. David raised a hand, silencing her before she could even begin. "You have falsely accused my son," he continued, each syllable precise and steady, like landing gear locking into place, "and humiliated him in front of your peers." He paused, letting the words hang heavy, thick as fog on a dark runway. "You did all of this without evidence, driven by your own prejudice," he said, voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "This is not just a failure of judgment, this is a failure of humanity." Whitman opened her mouth again, her voice cracking as she tried to defend herself. "Mr. Jackson, I." David raised his hand again, cutting her off like a final radio call before silence. "You do not get to speak," he said. "Not after what you've done." Elijah stood frozen beside his father, feeling each word strike the walls around them, shaking loose the lies that had trapped him moments before. David turned to the security officers next, his expression unwavering. "Release him," he ordered. "Right now." The officers hesitated, glancing at each other, then at Whitman, but something in David's voice, the unmistakable certainty of a man who had weathered storms far greater than this, made them obey without a word. They stepped back, hands dropping to their sides, their eyes lowered. Elijah's shoulders dropped as the invisible chains slipped off him, breath finally filling his lungs like a sudden gust of warm air. David turned back to Whitman, stepping close enough that she shrank into herself. "You owe my son, and every single person watching, an explanation," he said, each word punctuated like a captain's final pre-flight checklist. The room fell into a thick, heavy silence, every pair of eyes pinned on Whitman as if waiting for her mask to shatter completely. In that charged space, Elijah clung to his father's steady presence, the first true shelter he had felt since stepping into this cold, polished room. David shifted slightly, standing taller, his voice rising again. "And we will not leave this room," he said, eyes boring into Whitman's soul, "until the truth is laid bare before every witness here." A hushed wave moved through the pilots, each of them caught in the sudden shift of power. In that moment, Elijah felt something begin to mend deep inside him, a small, trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, the sky hadn't turned its back on him after all. One of the FAA officials stepped forward, a slim tablet in his hand glowing under the sterile lounge lights. He connected it to the large wall screen, the click echoing like a gavel in a silent courtroom. Every pilot in the room turned, breaths caught midair, as the screen flickered to life. The footage began to roll. Elijah appeared on screen, following Tanya Reynolds through the security checkpoint, his badge clearly visible, his expression bright and innocent. They stopped at the pilot's lounge entrance. Tanya handed him the badge again, her smile gentle as she pointed out where to sit. Elijah entered, careful and reverent, settling into a seat without touching anything else, eyes locked on the documentary playing softly. The room filled with a sharp, collective inhale. No faked credentials, no wandering, no threat, just a boy chasing a dream. The camera then showed Tanya stepping away to handle paperwork, the door closing softly behind her. A hush blanketed the lounge as the footage ended. The official cleared his throat, his voice firm, each word sharp enough to draw blood. "This clearly confirms that Elijah Jackson was authorized to be here, under direct escort from HR. There was no breach, no false badge, no security threat." A wave of murmurs spread like ripples on water, pilots shifting uncomfortably, some exchanging ashamed glances. Whitman stood rigid, her face draining of color, her mouth opening and closing without sound, like a fish stranded on dry land. Elijah felt the knots inside his chest loosen, the crushing weight that had pinned his heart slowly lifting away. He looked at his father, who gave a single nod, eyes still burning, but now filled with something gentler, pride and relief. The official continued, tapping the tablet again. "In addition," he said, his voice gaining weight, "we reviewed Captain Whitman's prior records. We have documented multiple formal complaints regarding discriminatory behavior, including false accusations against staff and guests of color." A stunned gasp ran through the crowd, sharp as a slap. Pilots recoiled as though realizing they had been standing on thin ice all along. Whitman's eyes darted desperately around the room, searching for any sympathetic face, but found none. Her shoulders buckled slightly, her once proud figure shrinking under the hot gaze of her peers. David stepped closer, his voice low and rumbling, filled with controlled fury. "You didn't just humiliate my son," he said, each word landing like a hammer. "You tried to strip him of his dignity. You tried to bury his future under your prejudice." Whitman's lips trembled, a thin thread of a voice finally breaking through. I was only trying to protect the lounge. I didn't know." David's stare hardened, his next words cutting through her feeble defense. "You didn't want to know," he said, "because you had already decided who he was the moment you saw his face." The pilots behind her shifted further away, as if the ground beneath her had become poison. The silence grew, thick and heavy, vibrating with unspoken shame and dawning clarity. Elijah felt the room tilt, the tide turning at last. For the first time since he arrived, he could stand a little straighter, breathe a little deeper. A fragile warmth flickered inside him, fragile but alive. A signal from the sky that it was not lost to him yet. And in that rising quiet, as all eyes bore into Whitman's crumbling figure, Elijah realized that sometimes the truth didn't roar like an engine. Sometimes it cut through the dark as quietly and inevitably as sunrise. Whitman staggered backward, her breath catching in short, ragged gasps as if she were choking on her own unraveling lies. The pilots who had once admired her authority now looked at her with faces carved from stone, eyes sharp with betrayal. David stepped forward again, the space between them closing like a tightening noose. "You abused your power," he said, his voice a deep, unwavering current. "And today you will answer for it in front of every single witness here." Whitman's eyes darted desperately across the room, searching for anyone who might step in to defend her. But every gaze turned away, each step back like a silent verdict. Her lips quivered, voice emerging as a thin, trembling thread. I didn't mean I was just doing my duty protecting." David's hand shot up, silencing her once more. "No," he said, the word as final as a slammed cockpit door. "You were protecting nothing but your own prejudice. You saw my son, and you decided he was an intruder before you even heard a single word from him." Whitman's face crumpled, the proud angles collapsing into something unrecognizable. The FAA official moved closer, his tone clinical, cold as frost on a runway at dawn. "Captain Whitman," he announced, his voice echoing in the stunned room. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from all duties pending a full investigation into your conduct and prior complaints." The words landed like a hammer striking glass. Whitman's knees buckled slightly, her hand reaching for the edge of a nearby chair, fingers scraping uselessly against the polished surface. She looked up at David, her voice barely more than a ghost. "Please, Mr. Jackson, I didn't know he was your son if I had known." David's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "It should not have mattered whose son he was. It should have mattered that he was a boy with a dream, standing exactly where he was meant to be." A hush swept across the room, the truth sinking into every corner like morning fog. Whitman's shoulders slumped, her figure shrinking as if gravity itself had turned against her. Security officers stepped forward, their expressions impassive, uniforms crisp and unyielding. They flanked her on either side, her breath quickening, a silent plea rising in her throat but dying before it could form words. Elijah watched, each second stretching into forever. Part of him felt a sharp, righteous satisfaction. Another part felt an unexpected ache, a hollow echo of what hatred and fear could reduce a person to. As Whitman was escorted toward the door, she cast one last look over her shoulder, a look that dissolved into something small and lost. The pilots parted without a word, turning their faces away as she passed, a silent procession of rejection. David stood tall beside Elijah, his presence a warm, immovable wall. When the door finally closed behind Whitman, a heavy silence clung to the room like fog after rain. Elijah exhaled, his lungs filling with air that tasted like freedom for the first time in hours. The last fragments of fear in his chest began to crumble, replaced by a cautious, trembling strength. And in that charged quiet, he realized he had just witnessed the fall of a fortress built on fear, and the first fragile rise of his own unbreakable sky. The door stayed closed behind Whitman, but the tension in the room slowly began to dissolve, like ice melting under the first warm rays of spring. Elijah stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if afraid that looking up might break the fragile sense of safety returning to him. David kept his hand firmly on his son's shoulder, his presence a constant lighthouse cutting through the fading storm. A rustle of movement drew Elijah's gaze upward. Captain Amara Johnson stepped forward from the back of the crowd, her uniform crisp, her steps measured and strong. Her dark eyes met Elijah's, warm and steady, a stark contrast to the cold daggers he had faced before. She offered a gentle smile, a quiet invitation to trust. "Elijah," she said, her voice rich and calm, "I'm Captain Amara Johnson. I watched everything that happened here today, and I want you to know you didn't deserve any of it." Elijah's lips parted, but no sound came. The words felt like a balm on wounds still too raw to speak of. Amara's gaze softened even more, her hand reaching out slowly, so he could see she meant no harm. "Would you like to see where you truly belong?" she asked, her voice lowering to a gentle whisper, as if offering a sacred secret. Elijah blinked, eyes shimmering, then nodded, his heart beating in new rhythms he had thought he'd lost forever. Amara turned slightly, extending her arm in a quiet gesture of guidance. David's hand slipped from Elijah's shoulder, resting instead on his back with a final, reassuring squeeze. Elijah took his first step forward, his shoes clicking on the floor, each sound a small defiance against the echoes of shame that had tried to hold him down. The pilots and staff parted to make way, their eyes following Elijah not with suspicion, but with newfound respect, and for some, with a guilt that would linger far beyond this day. As they left the lounge, the corridor felt like a new world unfolding. Amara walked beside him, her presence strong but comforting, a protective wing sheltering him from the last chills of doubt. They approached the wide glass doors leading to the tarmac, where sunlight spilled across the concrete like a bright runway into another life. In the distance, a towering Boeing 787 stood waiting, its nose pointed skyward as if calling to him directly. Elijah paused, a shiver running through him that felt like both fear and awe braided together. Amara leaned in closer, her voice low, resonating deep in his bones. "That cockpit," she said, her hand gesturing toward the plane. "That's where your heart has always wanted to be. You've already shown today that you have more courage than most people ever find in a lifetime." Elijah swallowed hard, his eyes locked on the plane, his dream rising before him in full, breathtaking detail. For the first time that day, he allowed a small smile to bloom across his lips, fragile but real. Amara watched him, her eyes reflecting a fierce pride, as if she could already see the future he would claim for himself. In that moment, under the open sky and the roar of distant engines, Elijah felt the impossible become possible again, and every step forward felt like the first true flight of his soul. Elijah followed Captain Johnson up the metal steps, each footfall echoing into the open air like a promise. The morning light gleamed off the aircraft's polished skin, and for a moment, Elijah felt as though he were walking into a dream so bright it might dissolve under his touch. At the top of the stairs, Amara paused, turning to look back at him with a soft, encouraging nod. He took a breath so deep it seemed to reach every corner of the sky above, then stepped forward into the cockpit. The space inside was tighter than he imagined, yet it felt vast, a galaxy of buttons and screens glowing with quiet power. The faint scent of metal and fabric, the soft hum of sleeping engines, wrapped around him like a long-lost embrace. Amara moved to the captain's seat, her hands resting lightly on the controls, her fingers curled as if holding an old friend. She gestured for Elijah to slide into the first officer's seat. With trembling hands, he lowered himself, every movement careful, reverent, as if he might break the air itself. His eyes traced the lines of the instrument panels, the shimmering displays, the throttle that looked like the lever to another world. He reached out slowly, fingertips hovering just above the yoke. A sudden rush of memories flooded his mind. The nights spent on his flight simulator, the paper airplanes launched from his childhood window, the quiet voice of his father saying he could soar if he believed. He let his fingers settle onto the yoke at last, feeling the shape, the quiet weight of possibility. Amara watched him, her eyes soft but alight with a deep, unspoken pride. "You see," she said, her voice low, strong as a heartbeat. "This is yours. It always has been. No one can take this from you unless you let them." Elijah looked at her, his eyes wide, shimmering under the soft cabin light. Then he looked forward again, seeing not just the empty runway but a horizon that stretched past every limit he had ever known. For a moment, his breath caught, a small tremor running through his chest, and he let out a single, sharp exhale, as if finally letting go of all the darkness that had clung to him. He felt his spine straighten, his shoulders lift, the heavy ghosts of fear and doubt slipping away like vapor at sunrise. Elijah turned his head, a small, steady smile blooming on his face, not just a smile of relief, but a fierce, living promise. a promise that he would never again allow anyone to define his worth, to shrink his sky. Amara reached over, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I want you to remember this feeling," she said, her voice almost a whisper now. "Because one day it will be you leading someone else into this seat, and you'll show them the same light you carry now." Elijah nodded, his fingers curling tighter around the yoke, a new strength radiating from his core. Outside, the engines of other planes roared and thundered in the distance, a symphony that felt like it was playing just for him. In that sacred space, surrounded by switches and dreams, Elijah finally felt what it meant to belong. Not just to a place, but to a destiny waiting for him in the endless blue above. Months later, Elijah stood on a stage at a crowded community center, a microphone trembling slightly in his hand. Rows of young faces looked up at him, some wide-eyed, some cautious, all hungry for something real. He cleared his throat, feeling a small echo of the fear that once choked him, but it no longer had power over him. "My name is Elijah Jackson," he began, his voice strong and steady, each word rising like a plane on takeoff. "And I used to believe that my dreams could be taken from me just because of who I am." A hush fell over the room, each breath held tight as if no one dared interrupt. "I stood in a place where I felt completely alone," he continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "Where people decided I didn't belong before I even had a chance to speak. But that day didn't break me, it built me." He paused, the memory of the cockpit returning to him, the weight of the yoke under his fingers, the taste of freedom he had carried in his chest ever since. "Now, I stand here to tell you, no one has the right to shrink your dreams," he said, his voice rising, stronger than the roar of any engine. "Your worth is not determined by their fear or their ignorance. You decide it. You alone." The audience erupted in applause, hands clapping, some kids jumping from their seats, their eyes shining like runway lights in the night. In the front row, David watched, his hands folded, a gentle, unwavering pride lighting his face. After the talk, children lined up to meet Elijah, some shyly clutching model airplanes, others bouncing on their toes with excitement. He knelt down to each of them, listening to their hopes, signing badges, handing out small stickers that read "Future Pilot." Outside the community center, a large banner hung high. "Fly beyond fear, inspire the sky." News cameras captured the moment, microphones pushed forward, questions fired, but Elijah's focus stayed on the children, the future rising in their eyes. Later, walking back to the parking lot, Elijah looked up at the evening sky, the last streaks of sunset cutting across the fading blue like paths waiting to be flown. David came to stand beside him, his voice soft but carrying the same unyielding strength. "You've become the man I always knew you would be," he said. "A guide, a fighter, and a dreamer." Elijah turned, a quiet laugh slipping from his lips, his eyes bright with the reflection of the stars just beginning to wake. "Thank you," he said, his voice full but unburdened, "for teaching me to keep my wings even when they tried to tear them away." David pulled him into a firm hug, the kind that spoke without words, a shelter and a launch pad all at once. When they pulled apart, Elijah took one last long look at the sky, his fingers curling as if they still held the yoke. He knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that his journey was only beginning. He would carry his story into every new sunrise, every tarmac, every young heart brave enough to listen. And as the night embraced the city below, Elijah stood tall, ready to fly not just for himself, but for every soul who dared to dream beyond the clouds.